Budgetary Policy.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Carleton.
I regret to inform the House of Commons that I will be terminating my remarks as soon as the Prime Minister comes in and announces that there will be a full-scale parliamentary investigation into his interference in SNC-Lavalin. I guess I will not be terminating my remarks just yet, Mr. Speaker. They will have to go on. And I'm getting some heckles from across the way from my colleagues. Somebody yelled across the way that I have a crooked tie. It is better to have a crooked tie than a crooked leader.
I'd ask honourable members, including member for Carleton, to be careful in their choice of words and not use characterizations of individual members. Order. And we should always avoid characterizing individual members as opposed to a government, a party, etc., or policies or decisions. That's another matter. Honourable member for Carleton.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. But there are new developments in the SNC-Lavalin scandal just breaking today, and I rise today to bring them to the House's attention. As you'll recall, Mr. Speaker, the Justice Committee decided to convene an investigation into the Prime Minister's interference in the criminal prosecution of the company known as SNC-Lavalin. That investigation, unfortunately, was short-lived. As revelations about the Prime Minister and his team's 20 points of contact with the former Attorney General, in which they made veiled threats, in which they interfered, in which they applied inappropriate pressure, as all of this came to light in the committee, members of the Liberal side, who constitute a majority, voted to shut down the investigation altogether. I was present when that happened, and it was clear that the government had engaged in a cover-up. Now, that being said, we concluded at the time that there was still hope of getting to the truth, and that hope resided in the Ethics Committee. As such, numerous members of this House wrote the chairman of that committee, who would confirm that a motion to carry out an investigation into the SNC-Lavalin corruption scandal was in order. Roughly a week later, members convened at the Ethics Committee under the leadership of that chair and debated whether or not the committee should proceed with an investigation. One Liberal member on the committee had previously voted for a full-scale investigation into a full-scale public inquiry, and thus it was expected that he might be supportive of allowing the Ethics Committee to proceed in carrying out that investigation right within the parliamentary precinct. When presented with the opportunity to do so, and in vote in favor of the motion allowing the investigation to go ahead, he began to speak and said that he was not ruling out a future investigation at the committee, that perhaps at some future date an investigation could proceed, but that doing so would be premature before the Justice Committee had received all of its written submissions and before that Justice Committee had decided to conclude its own work. A second Liberal MP, the member for Ottawa-Vanier, said in a post-committee scrum with the media, "I believe that today we had a conversation on the fact that the Ethics Commissioner is currently studying, and that's why we are waiting for him to get back to us and report. Also, the Justice Committee is working on it as we speak. The chair of that committee will receive more information, so it is premature for us to go forward." I emphasize, premature for us to go forward. So, Mr. Speaker, two members of the Liberal delegation on the Ethics Committee expressed an openness to having a full-scale committee investigation into the SNC-Lavalin corruption scandal. But they had concluded that it would be premature to do so until such time as the Justice Committee received all of its written submissions and heard all of its testimony and concluded its own work on the file. In fairness to those two Liberal members, while I disagree with them, it's a reasonable point of view. No need to have two committees doing the same thing at one time. In other words, why not wait to find out what Justice Committee was going to do with all of the testimony it had received and what it would eventually do with the then forthcoming written submissions of text messages that both the former Attorney General and Gerald Butts were to provide. Well, now the Justice Committee has done that. It has completely terminated the investigation. It has received all the written submissions. Those submissions have now been published for all eyes to see. The Justice Committee's work is known, and according to Liberal members as of this morning, who met in a secret in-camera meeting, that committee will do no more work on this file. So, the two Liberal members of the Ethics Committee who were waiting on justice to wrap up in order to get final evidence that that committee report would provide is done. And they are ready now. They can no longer claim that it is premature for the Ethics Committee to begin its work. So I report to the House of Commons today, Mr. Speaker, that next Tuesday would be the appropriate day for the Ethics Committee to consider whether or not to proceed with the investigation into the Prime Minister's SNC-Lavalin corruption scandal. I note that he has attempted to shut down two previous investigations. That might cause pessimism among members of this House. However, I also note that there is reason for hope and optimism in that at least two Liberal members of the Ethics Committee have now said that their opposition to an investigation was time limited. In other words, that because it was premature at the time the motion for such investigation came before the committee, they may now have changed their mind because all of the information that another committee has to provide is now provided. And so the conversation now shifts over to the Ethics Committee, where we will once again debate whether to open an investigation into this file. Now, the Prime Minister has tried to put this matter to rest by shutting it down. Now, when I say the term shut down, I'm quoting the Prime Minister's former Treasury Board president. This is not an allegation of an opposition MP. These are the words of a former member of the Prime Minister's inner circle, a doctor, a woman to whom the Prime Minister entrusted one of the most senior cabinet positions any Prime Minister can offer. She has indicated she believes the government is trying to shut down the investigation into this scandal. It's not working. The Prime Minister has been incapable of grabbing this scandal and forcing it underground. Every time he tries, the people of Canada, as well as conscientious members of his own caucus, speak up against him. So I believe that he will have to conclude 1 week from today that his only recourse is to open the entire matter up for all eyes to see.
Yep.
As he was fond of saying in the last election, sunshine is the greatest disinfectant. So let's lift the curtains over at the Ethics Committee and let the sunshine pour in so that everyone can see the truth.
Sunny ways.
Sunny ways, my friends, sunny ways, as a Prime Minister we all know once said. So, Mr. Speaker, I put you and the House on notice that next Tuesday, a week from today, we will all be watching carefully as Liberal members join with Conservative and NDP members to determine whether or not to end the cover-up and open up a full-scale investigation to get to the truth in this matter. With that notice having been given, Mr. Speaker, I now turn your attention to another important legal matter. We are lawmakers, ergo we mustn't be law breakers. And there is an important law passed into effect in the previous Parliament called the Reform Act.
Oh, yeah.
And that bill came from the member for Wellington Halton Hills, excuse me.
Great member.
He has long been a student of Parliament and an advocate for its supremacy. The member came forward with this bill in the previous Parliament with the intended purpose of limiting the executive branch's ability to commandeer the House of Commons at the expense of the public interest. And it was under the previous government that the bill was in fact passed, and it did two principal things, Mr. Speaker. One, took away the legal authority of party leaders to ban candidates from running. It used to be in the Election Act that you could not be a candidate for a political party unless you had a signature from the leader of that party. That created a bias within the Act in favor of the party leadership and against the grassroots. The Reform Act instead allowed the party to assign any authority it chose to have the power to accept or reject candidates. So in other words, a party could say that a local electoral district association president or some other trusted figure has the authority to accept or reject candidacies. But no longer would it be a given under law that such authority would reside exclusively in the hands of the leader. Now, it is possible for a party to craft its own constitution, as any free organization can in an open civil society, to assign that power to its leader. But that decision now rests with the party and not with the law. So that was the first change. The second change that the Reform Act made was particularly relevant to today's conversation. It stated that at the first caucus meeting of every party after an election occurs, there must be a vote on whether or not to apply a set of rules to determine how you the expulsion of members of that caucus. In other words, In the past, party leaders have been able to just banish people from the caucus arbitrarily. This law empowered caucuses to create a set of enforceable rules that are embedded in legislation whereby no one can be removed from a caucus without a vote of the caucus members. At the very first Conservative caucus meeting after the last election, we decided to vote in favor of applying that rule to our caucus. So, the Conservative Party, as it stands now and in this Parliament, cannot remove members from caucus without holding a vote of caucus members. In other words, a party leader cannot simply wake up one day and say that Mr. Smith is no longer a member of the Conservative Party. Instead, caucus members need to vote on the future of Mr. Smith. And that brings us to today's debate, because we are now hearing rumors of retaliation against two courageous whistleblowers in the Liberal ranks. Both the former Attorney General and the former Treasury Board President had the incredible audacity to tell the truth about the Prime Minister's conduct in the SNC-Lavalin affair. Numerous of the Prime Minister's top supporters in caucus have gone to media outlets and suggested that they should be banished from the caucus altogether because they dared speak up and defend that truth. The argument goes, should be punished for allowing Canadians to learn that the Prime Minister interfered in a criminal prosecution. Here's the hiccup, the legal hiccup. It turns out that the Liberal caucus failed to follow the law and hold a vote at its first caucus meeting to determine whether or not there would be rules for the expulsion of members. In other words, if the caucus decides to expel these members, that expulsion might be illegal. I want to read you some background. This is a letter that the Honourable Member for Wellington Halton Hills wrote to the current Attorney General. Dear Minister, I'd like to congratulate you on your new role as the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General of Canada. In a letter to the previous Minister of Justice and the Attorney General of Canada dated February 29, 2016, I brought to the Minister's attention the possible non-compliance of Section 49(8) of the Parliament of Canada Act by members of the Cabinet. I also sent a letter to the Deputy Minister of Justice and the Attorney General of Canada dated May 11, 2016, voicing the same concern. Both the Minister and Deputy Minister did not respond to me directly, and as such, I have no idea of what action, if any, was taken. I am now bringing this matter directly to your attention for your consideration and action. As you are aware, the Minister of Justice and Attorney General is the Chief Law Officer of the Crown, responsible for ensuring that the administration of public affairs is in accordance with the law, and responsible for upholding the rule of law. The Attorney General has a duty to provide objective legal advice in order to ensure that government action complies with the law. Given that the government is bound by the rule of law as well as the Attorney General's advice on legal affairs, traditionally it must be accepted by Cabinet even if it is unpopular policy. As you are also aware, the Reform Act passed in the House of Commons on February 25, 2015, passed in the Senate on June 22, 2015, received royal assent on June 23, 2015, and subsequently came into force on October 26, 2015. It amended the Parliament of Canada Act. According to Section 49(8) of the Parliament of Canada Act, appended for ease of reference, at the first meeting following a general election, the caucus of every recognized party in the House of Commons must conduct a separate recorded vote among the caucus members in respect of each of the following questions. A, whether sections 49.2 and 49.3 are to apply in respect of the caucus. B, whether section 49.4 is to apply in respect of the caucus. C, whether section 49.5, 1 and 3 are to apply in respect of the caucus. And D, whether section 49.5.4 and section 49.6 are to apply in respect of the caucus. Furthermore, section 49.8 stipulates that as soon as feasible after the conduct of the votes, the chair of the caucus shall inform the Speaker of the House of Commons of the outcome of each vote. It has been publicly reported by various news media, one report of which is appended for ease of reference, that the Liberal members of Parliament, including ministers, did not comply with Section 49.8 of the Parliament of Canada Act, instead deciding to defer the 4 votes. This appears to be in contravention of the Parliament of Canada Act. The Minister of Justice and Attorney General is responsible for upholding the rule of law and ensuring Cabinet acts in accordance with the law, and is ultimately accountable to the House of Commons. I ask that you uphold your constitutional and statutory responsibility and take necessary steps to ensure that the government complies with Section 49.8 of the Parliament of Canada Act. While Section 49.8 concerns the conduct of not just ministers but all members of Parliament recognized in the House of Commons, it is important that, according to open and accountable, according to Open and Accountable Government, a document, ministers are to be held to the highest standards of conduct for all their actions, including those that are not directly related to their official functions. Ministers, therefore, are therefore expected to adhere to these standards in circumstances whether they are acting as a minister or a member of Parliament or a private citizen. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Please do not hesitate to contact me if you have any questions. In other words, the member was laying out very clearly that there are laws that determine how a caucus must conduct itself, and that those laws determine how members can or cannot be expelled. So far, the Liberal Party is not in respect of those laws. All other caucuses held votes to ensure that they were in compliance with the Parliament of Canada Act. To simplify it, this is what it means. If you're sitting back home right now, you're wondering whether your member of Parliament works for you or works for the party leader, ask yourself who can remove that member of Parliament from his or her caucus.
Exactly.
If the answer is that the leader simply removes the caucus member, then apparently that caucus member works for the leader. If, on the other hand, as is the case in the Conservative Party, your member of Parliament works in a caucus that is bound by the Parliament of Canada Act to ensure that no one can be removed except by vote of a majority of MPs in that caucus, then your MP works for you. That's how simple it is. Now, it's not that the Liberal caucus failed to decide to give the leader the power to remove members of its caucus. It's that it broke the law requiring that the caucus itself set rules for expulsion of members. And in so doing, we are now in this, the Liberal caucus is now in a legal twilight zone, unable to tell anybody the legal procedure required for 2 of its senior members to be expelled from the caucus. I understand it has been brought to my attention, Mr. Speaker, that Liberal caucus meetings have been going on all day, that Ontario Liberals have gathered to discuss the future of the former Attorney General and former Treasury Board President. They are discussing whether or not those 2 distinguished parliamentarians should be punted from the Liberal caucus altogether. But here's the problem. They can't do it legally until they have addressed the requirement in the Parliament of Canada Act, which stipulates that they must decide whether a leader or a caucus has the power to do that. The Liberal Party very much risks finding itself in yet another legal crisis in the next day. Tomorrow its caucus will meet, and I understand that there may well be a decision to expel members of the caucus. But we don't know how that decision will be made, because so far the Liberals are in violation of the Parliament Canada Act, which stipulates how exactly that procedure carries itself out.
Shameful.
It is shameful that the Liberal Party has found a way to break the law, even in circumstances that relate to its own caucus management. I might add that while this sounds really complicated, it's actually quite simple. The Act just says, once you have an election, caucus gets into a room, they hold a vote on the rules for expulsions of members. We did it, took us about 10 minutes. We as a group decided that caucus members could only be expelled through a vote of the full caucus. That stripped a future leader of the ability to remove anyone arbitrarily, and it empowered MPs from whether they are in the front, middle, or back bench to be equal in making that decision.
Hear, hear.
Thank you. And there are members of the NDP who I believe did exactly the same thing. They held the same vote, and they were required to under the Act. And so I believe, it is my understanding, though I wasn't there, that they did as well. But of course the Liberal Party refused to abide by this legal requirement and make that administrative decision on its first day. And now they are caught in this strange situation where they want to carry out retribution against courageous whistleblowers in their own caucus. The Prime Minister is determined to have them kicked out and punished for speaking their minds, but nobody knows the legal status of an expulsion from the Liberal caucus. Mr. Speaker, I bring this to your attention because it could land on your desk. You could find yourself as the arbiter of this messy situation that the government has created for itself by failing to follow the legal steps that are provided for in the Parliament of Canada Act. Now, I have my opinions on whether or not the members of the former Treasury Board President and the Attorney General should or should not be allowed to remain. I think absolutely they have the right to remain. In fact, they should be celebrated for their courage and for their honesty. But I believe that that decision should be, whatever decision the Liberals make, and it is theirs to make, not mine, should be done in accordance with the law.
Yeah, hear, hear.
The Prime Minister appears follow the law. The Prime Minister broke the law when he took a $250,000 free vacation from someone who was seeking a government grant.
Yep.
He has broken, at the very least, the spirit of the law by applying inappropriate pressure and interfering in the criminal prosecution of his corporate friends SNC-Lavalin. For God's sakes, let him not break the law as he carries out retribution against the courageous whistleblowers who exposed him for that earlier misconduct. He has some time in order to fix the legal problems within his caucus. He could potentially, with counsel from you, Mr. Speaker, and the law clerk, convene another caucus meeting to discuss the application of the Reform Act to his caucus. I believe that after he does that, he would have to table in the House of Commons a full report on how he and his caucus have come into compliance with that act. But failing that, he is operating lawlessly as he attempts to punish those who have spoken against him. And speaking of the law, there's another law that's worth noting in this affair. And it is the whistleblower protection law that exists for public servants. I was proud to serve as the parliamentary secretary in the Harper government that passed into effect the Accountability Act, which contained protections for whistleblowers. You'll recall that the impetus for this act was that a courageous whistleblower, Alan Cutler, had spoken up against the sponsorship scandal. He witnessed that money was being funneled out of the coffers of the government into the Liberal Party of Canada and to Liberal-linked ad agencies. He blew the whistle and he was fired. He was fired for speaking up. He suffered serious career damage as a result. So we passed a law to protect public sector whistleblowers in the event that they witness wrongdoing. They are allowed under the law to make a formal complaint, to seek an investigation with the Public Service Integrity Commissioner, who then carries out an investigation. Now, I acknowledge that the Public Service Integrity Commissioner does not have jurisdiction over a party caucus or over cabinet ministers. It strictly applies to members of the public service. However, this is about the example we set as political leaders. If we have a law that protects public servants who blow the whistle against retaliation, how could the Prime Minister violate the principles of that law by punishing the whistleblowers in his own cabinet? What message would he send to public servants about the propriety of standing up and speaking out when you see something wrong if he punishes the very people who've done just that? The Prime Minister should do is first apologize to both of these whistleblowers, and secondly, thank them. Thank them for standing in his way when he was trying to behave inappropriately. The Attorney General may have done this Prime Minister, the former Attorney General, may have done this Prime Minister an incredible service when she refused his personal and political interference in the prosecution of SNC-Lavalin. She may have been helping him in a strange way by stopping him from doing something very dangerous, both to himself and to our legal and justice system. She warned him in the most emphatic way that he ought not push her any further. Allow me for a moment, Mr. Speaker, to reflect on the chronology of those warnings. It started on September 18th, 2018, when the Prime Minister and the Clerk of the Privy Council called in the Attorney General and pushed her to allow a settlement with SNC-Lavalin that would shelve criminal charges for fraud and bribery. She made clear at that point she wasn't interested in giving the company a special deal, as the company simply did not qualify for a settlement. He pushed some more. He made up stories about how the company headquarters would leave if she did not immediately intervene. Stories we now know are patently false. Still, she stood her ground, so he pushed again. And so she says, I looked him in the eye. And I said, Prime Minister, are you interfering with my work as Attorney General? Because I strongly advise against it. You'd think he would have got the message, but unfortunately that was just the beginning. Then, in the days that followed, his senior staff would continue the pressure campaign. The Finance Minister would jump in on the action as well. Strangely, he personally met with senior...
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader on a point of order.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I would ask that you take into consideration procedures and practices, in particular if we were to go to page 625, repetition and relevance in debate. The rules of relevance and repetition are intertwined and mutually reinforcing. The requirements that speeches remain relevant to the question before the House flows from the latter's right to reach decisions without undue obstruction and to exclude from debate any discussion not conducive to that end. The rule against repetition helps to ensure that the expeditious conduct of debate by prohibiting the repetition of arguments already made. To neglect either rule would seriously impair the ability of the House to manage its time effectively. If you just take a look at the hours of discussion from the member across the way, you will find that there is consistent duplication, repetition, repeating the same points after the same points, and we're actually talking about the 2019-2020 budget. I just bring it to your attention so maybe periodically we can just get the member to go back to what the debate's about, and that is the budget.
I thank the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for raising the point. Of course, what he says I am in complete familiarity with. It is a topic that does come up from time to time. One of the limitations on that for chair occupants is, of course, that one has to actually hear what the member says before one can be enlightened as to whether a bridge has been crossed or a line has been crossed in terms of repetition and relevance. That's one of the difficulties in coming to that conclusion. And I can assure the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary that I'll remain vigilant and listen carefully to what the Honourable Member has to say, and certainly, should it be necessary, to remind him, as with all honourable members when they're in the midst of debate, to avoid, in fact, steer clear from a repetition of arguments that have already been presented to the House, and to ensure that they are relevant to the question that's at hand. Final point on that simply is that, of course, on budgetary matters, the degree of liberty that members have to make their arguments on budget matters, of course, is quite vast. And so with that in mind, we'll listen carefully. I do see a couple of other honourable members on their feet. The honourable member for Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston. Is this on the same point of order? The honourable member.
It is, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to say that while I appreciate that the honourable parliamentary secretary is here more or less all the time and in consequence hears every single word that is spoken in this House, and I am not here quite as frequently, having committee duty and so on, I do want to observe that the reason I'm still here right now is because of the fact that the honourable member was making novel points that I was not yet familiar with, and I don't see, in fact, that from my perspective, there is repetition going on. Thank you.
Formact.
The honourable member for Brantford Brant, is this on the same point of order? The honourable
Rocky Ridge.
Oh, I'm sorry. My apologies. The honourable member for Calgary Rocky Ridge. Is this on the same point of order?
Yes, it is, Mr.
The honourable member.
Thank you. And I listened carefully to the intervention from the Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader, and I have risen myself on this standing order a number of times in this Parliament, and I note that in response to members that have brought the rule of relevance to your attention, that in this Parliament there has been a very broad use and application of this standing order, and that's been the answer from the chair in most instances. In fact, almost every instance I can think of where this is raised. So I assume that that will continue and that there will be broad latitude given on this standing order.
I thank the honourable member for Calgary Rocky Ridge and apologize for getting his riding name wrong and not mentioning anything about the similarities in look with the honourable member for Brantford Brant. Two outstanding gentlemen, I'm sure, but nonetheless, we do make that mistake from time to time. I thank all honourable members for their interventions. As this is an important standing order for the House, and we'll be observant of that and pay close attention. We'll go back now to the honourable member for Carleton.
Mr. Speaker. I will note with interest that the Liberals now claim that the matter of deferred prosecution agreements has nothing to do with budget policy. That is ironic indeed, because those deferred prosecution agreements were created in the budget bill that they introduced here in the House of Commons. So if they thought at the time that it was not a budget measure, why'd they put it in the budget? They thought it was completely irrelevant to the budget. Why was it in the budget bill? Yeah. And the answer is, of course, is that it should never have been in the budget. But now that it has been, it is perfectly fair game during this budget debate to discuss it. And we learn, Mr. Speaker, every day another form of deceit, another contradiction, just like this one. You know, less than a year ago, Liberals were claiming that this tool to allow corporations to avoid trial was a budget measure. They forced it through the Finance Committee, through the House of Commons, then through the Senate Finance Committee, again and again claiming this is a budget matter. And now we have a member who stands up and says, this has nothing to do with the budget, it's completely irrelevant. And isn't that the whole story of this scandal?
Absolutely.
One flip-flop after another, one change after another in the version of events and in the stories that they tell. They will say anything at any time in order to justify their inappropriate conduct. And this intervention by the colleague across the way is just the latest example of that. I can point to other contradictions, you know, where the Prime Minister says, here is it, on February 15th, he came out and said to 37 million Canadians, if anyone, including the former Attorney General, had issues with anything they might have experienced in this government, or didn't feel that we were living up to the high standards we set for itself, it was her responsibility to come forward. It was their responsibility to come forward. And no one did. And yet, of course, that is absolutely false. She did come forward again and again and again, to the Prime Minister personally on September 18th, then to his clerk of the Privy Council, when she said in a recorded conversation about which top Liberals cannot lie and deny because it is all caught on tape, she said, so we are treading on dangerous ground here, and I'm going to issue my stern warning, because I cannot act in a manner, and the prosecution cannot act in a manner that is not objective, that isn't independent. I cannot act in a partisan way, and I cannot be politically motivated. All of this screams of that. If that is not a warning, I don't know what is. Now, the latest story from the Prime Minister is he never heard about that conversation. You know, when an Attorney General has an explosive conversation of this nature with the top public servant about a priority file for the Prime Minister, and in the 2 months that follows, the Prime Minister does not hear a word about it. Now, of course, the story from the government was that, oh, he didn't hear about it because he immediately left for vacation. Well, it turns out the public record shows that's false. He didn't leave for vacation. He does take a lot of vacations, but unfortunately for his story, this was not one of the occasions when he did take such a vacation. And even if he had, this is what the clerk himself said on the availability of the Prime Minister. He said, there are multiple occasions where the minister could have expressed her concern to the Prime Minister, and every single day could have picked up the phone and called. Now, he goes on to say that the Prime Minister is available through the switchboard 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, and is working 7 days a week. The Prime Minister is interrupted all the time for calls with foreign leaders, security matters, heads up, end quote. So in other words, I'm going to go on further actually. All ministers have the option of reaching the Prime Minister, give or take a little bit of scheduling, and where he might be in private time and so on. Every minister of the Cabinet can reach the Prime Minister. I presume if that is true, then the clerk of the Privy Council could have found time in the 2 months that followed this extraordinary conversation with the Attorney General to relay its contents to the Prime Minister, but yet they expect us to believe he never did. And so the Prime Minister didn't know anything. His Chief of Staff was involved. in the interference, but he didn't know. His principal secretary and best friend was involved, but the Prime Minister didn't know. His senior advisor, Mathieu Bouchard, was involved, but the Prime Minister didn't know. The Prime Minister's top advisor, Elder Marquis, was involved in the interference, but the Prime Minister didn't know. The Finance Minister was involved in the interference, but the Prime Minister didn't know. The Finance Minister's Chief of Staff, Ben Chin, was involved in the interference, but the Prime Minister didn't know. Everyone was involved in this, as we now know, because of documented text message conversations, journal entries, and even audio recordings, right up to the Clerk of the Privy Council, but we're expected to believe that the Prime Minister did not know a thing.
But he works
24
hours.
He works according to the Clerk of the Privy Council. He works 24/7 and is available at any time, can be reached easily and brought up to date on all these matters. But somehow this one just slipped right by him. Mr. Speaker, why is it that Canadians find that so hard to believe? The answer is because it is not true. And that brings us to the matter of the Ethics Committee, which will convene on Tuesday, a week from today, to decide whether to carry out a full-scale investigation and hear from all of the key witnesses who are alleged to have interfered in the SNC-Lavalin scandal. We will be calling on all members of the Liberal Party to vote in favor of this study, but particularly the two members who said they were open to such investigation, but that it had just been too premature at the time it was brought before the committee when it last met. The Prime Minister needs to understand something that has become very difficult for him to appreciate. And it is this: the House of Commons does not work for him. It's the other way around. He holds that office only as long as a majority of MPs in this place say he holds that office. It's not an entitlement. It's not a family heirloom to be handed down from father to son. It is the property of the Canadian people. And through their delegation to us, it is our job to decide whether or not he is able to hold that office. And in the meantime, this chamber and its committees are one gigantic accountability machine. An accountability machine that demands answers for the government's conduct, and particularly the Prime Minister's conduct. This is not the Prime Minister's personal self-esteem factory. We don't exist here to try and elevate his sense of ego and self-importance. It is not the job of parliamentarians to gush and praise all over him and treat him with the adoration he expects and demands. That's not what Parliament does. Parliament is supposed to ask the difficult questions until such time as we get accurate and believable answers. So far, they have not been forthcoming. And so we march on, and I continue speaking on behalf of my constituents. But I think in this sense I'm carrying out the role that all MPs are supposed to do, which is to stand up, speak up, and fight back when they see something wrong. Exactly. You know something? It's not only opposition MPs that do that. There are courageous members of the government side who have been willing to take a principled position. For example, former Attorney General. She was prepared to put her principles ahead of her career ambitions. And then you have the former Treasury Board President, who likewise said she was not prepared to be part of the cover-up and that there's much more to this story that needs to be told. So, let's tell it. I'm ready to end my speech now. All I need is for a member of the government to stand up and commit that the Ethics Committee, the majority Liberal-controlled Ethics Committee, will open a full-scale investigation into the SNC-Lavalin corruption scandal. As soon as one member of the other side rises and purports to speak on behalf of the Prime Minister himself, I will terminate my remarks and allow the debate to go on otherwise. But until that happens, or until you stop me, Mr. Speaker, I will continue to speak up for accountability in the SNC-Lavalin corruption scandal. And I thank the members who are here with me, providing moral support for me to stand here on behalf of the Conservative caucus, but also on behalf of my constituents. And I notice a member is rising on a point of order.
I see the honourable member for Calgary Rocky Ridge. Now, he's in a different location, so I'm not sure which is his. I recall recognizing him from a different location, and I'll have to consult the seating chart to see which of it, in fact, was correct. Perhaps I was incorrect the last time. Oh, I see that he's in a different spot there now, so we must have been correct. So I see the honourable member for Calgary Rocky Ridge.